Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Phil Potter. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics, the Batten School, and I direct the National Security Policy Center at the Batten School as well. So for those of you who are UVA folks who have not been involved with us in the past, certainly look us up and get involved. So what I'm here to talk about today is political violence and repression in China, and particularly in the Xinjiang region, which is the far northwestern corner of China. And this is the home to the Uyghur minority that, among several other ethnic minorities in that region as well. But this is the sort of the group you've been hearing about in the news with regard to detention centers, major internment camps where well north of 1 million people have been held, according to reports, and a location where we've seen really significant Chinese repression over the last few years. And so what I want to talk to you about today is sort of the situation there, how we should be understanding that. And this is all kind of drawing on a book that I have finished and sort of under review and in the press process right now, that is kind of looking at this whole nexus of political violence and government response and over-response in that region. So what I want to do, and one other thing I should say at the outset is, as I sort of talk through this, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A. You don't need to wait to the end to start putting questions up there. I won't get to most of them until the Q&A period. I'll talk for 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can have a lively back and forth about whatever it is that you are interested in. So I think, for me, there's sort of three big questions that motivate my inquiry into this entire situation, right? Because what we're seeing is this sort of really outsized reaction from the Chinese state with regard to what has been a very low level of unrest and political violence when we look at it from a comparative perspective. So when you look at the violence from the Uyghur populations, or what might be characterized as political violence, or in some instances, relatively isolated instances, terrorism, the levels on it have been pretty low compared to what we see in Russia or another autocracy like that. But the response that you've gotten from the Chinese state has just been sort of remarkably outsized. And so, I think the first question is, hey, why is this happening? So first of all, what is happening? Second of all, why is it happening? And then third of all, is there anything that we in the United States or elsewhere can do to mitigate it, right? Are there policy responses from a foreign policy standpoint from the United States that might lead to better outcomes, fewer human rights violations, those sorts of things? And so the first thing that I want to do then is put up a poll for you to interact with while I'm talking. And what this is simply asking is, in your view, given what, perhaps relatively little you know about the situation, should the US be boycotting the 2022 Beijing Olympics in protest of the treatment of Chinese Uyghurs? Right. So this is an idea that has been put out there in terms of, hey, here's something that could be done to signal our discontent, whatever it might be. Simple poll, yes, no, not sure. And we'll kind of come back to that in a minute. All right. So just to give you a little bit of background about this overall situation, which is, something that I think most Americans had not heard of until quite recently. Right. So this is, as I said, the far northwestern corner of China. This is into Central Asia, right? This is bordering countries that I think a lot of Americans don't recognize that China even borders. Afghanistan, right? I think if you ask most Americans if China bordered Afghanistan, there would be a fairly emphatic no. The answer is, in fact, yes, right? But Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, various other countries are sort of arrayed around this region like a fan, right? And so this has a level of complexity to it that is underappreciated from a regional standpoint, right? And this is sort of Chinese Central Asian politics. And this has long been a point of contestation in Chinese affairs, right? So this is the sort of leading edge of Chinese power and has been for several hundred years. This is a contested history in this space. So when you talk to Uyghur nationalist organizations, diaspora organizations, they'll point to sort of proud periods of relative Uyghur independence and sort of national consciousness. If you talk to people on the Chinese side, historians on the Chinese side, it's very much sort of pointing to prior dynastic rule in the region, control, these sorts of things. The point is not for us to really arbitrate that, but more to recognize that this is in fact sort of a contested history, a contested space, a place where two cultures are really coming into steady contact with one another over time, right? But historically, it's always been a place where China has been, but has trouble controlling and maintaining dominance over long periods of time. Okay, so going back to this poll, just to give everyone a flavor of where we're heading, it looks like the split is relatively even, is how I would describe it. 23% yes, 38% no, 38% not sure. All right, and so we'll kind of come back to that and see what we think. I'll preface that by saying I think that the way this is lining up is fairly in keeping with what I would think the results should be. So contested region, and an afterthought through much of the history of the People's Republic of China. This was a place that was very much sort of out on the frontier, not something that folks were worrying about seriously in the Maoist period. What really brought it to the fore was the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of various states in that region as a consequence of the fall of the Soviet Union. And then that sort of followed immediately by, or sort of at the same time, by the situation in Tiananmen Square. And this gave rise to a sort of a budding sense of Uyghur nationalism, expectation that there may be some level of self-determination, as we know with regard to Tiananmen, but then also this reflected in Xinjiang as well. The Chinese state responded very, very differently than the Soviet Union to this sort of budding nationalism. So major crackdowns and an attempt to sort of stomp out those nascent independence movements. Fast forward slightly, another key sort of marker in this story were the 2008 Olympics in China, right? So this was a period in which Uyghur nationalist organizations, militant organizations were able to marshal a certain amount of actual coordinated violence around a campaign. This was jarring to the state, also relatively surprising to the outside world, because that level of coordination, the ability to project violence on demand when you want to in a coordinated way, is terrorism scholars will tell you that is sort of revealing of capacity, right? Latent capacity to do these activities when and where you would like to, right? And so that was a key moment. But where we really saw a sea shift here was in the sort of 2012 through 2014 range, all right? And so this coincides with the rise of Xi Jinping and increasing changes in the way China was run. But you see this sort of lead up in violence leading to some significant attacks at Kunming and then Tiananmen Square that really marked a substantial escalation, and really the first time that violence coming out of the region could be viewed properly as terrorist violence, or labeled as terrorist violence. The Kunming attack in particular, this was a coordinated attack on a railway station, often described in Chinese circles as sort of China's 9/11, really changed the way that the state was thinking about this situation. But one of the key themes that I like to sort of draw out for people is that what was really changing here wasn't the nature of the political violence, it was the nature of the Chinese system, the Chinese state. So the rise of Xi Jinping led to a situation where there was a fundamental shift in the nature of the source of legitimacy for the government, right? So with Xi came increasing emphasis on sort of the individual, strength, personalism, right? This is coming to sort of actively replace a prior form of legitimation that was based mostly on economic performance. This was a conversation that was sort of long-standing, that as China grew, this social contract that was based on we provide growth, you allow us to rule fairly uncontested, that was going to become shakier, right? Because the repeated cycles of 10, 12 or more % growth, it becomes very challenging, right? Once you ascend to a certain level. And so with Xi and with that sort of increased growth, you end up in a situation where the state is looking for other ways to sort of assert legitimacy. And this personalization around the leader plus increasing nationalism really come to replace that. And so the push toward nationalism, I think, is something that is very much underappreciated as an underpinning story for what has gone on in minority policy in Western China, right? And the extent to which that is very, very much tied up in sort of why the state is doing what it is doing, okay? And so what I think we therefore need to consider is how seriously we believe the Chinese state is going to react to policy moves like boycotting the Olympics aimed at pushing them on this dimension, right? Because this is integral to the way they are formulating legitimacy in the regime, it also becomes a very core interest, right? And very much linked to things that are going on elsewhere in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and so on. And so we have, I think, no choice but to sort of assert and push our values here and say, hey, no, this is not acceptable. We're going to sanction. We are going to perhaps even boycott. But what we really want to be careful about is moving into situations where we are talking in terms of ultimatums or in terms of fundamentally misunderstanding the plasticity of policy in these areas from the Chinese perspective. I would argue that given the way this is set up from a regime standpoint, it's really unlikely that we're going to see a lot of flex here, right? A lot of shift in policy. We've seen a little bit of a pullback from the high points of detention, some of the really repressive stuff, just to kind of get it out of the news. You see Chinese sort of diplomacy types really pushing back on this notion of labeling this as a genocide. But nonetheless, nothing has fundamentally changed on the ground, right? And this really goes to this fact that, hey, this is very much tied up in who has the right to rule in this country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some Q&A. I'm happy to talk about whatever you would like to talk about. All right, so the first question, and please do just sort of add questions as they occur to you, is what are the implications of this? What are the implications of what is going on in Xinjiang for the Belt and Road Initiative? So for those of you who might be a little less steeped in this stuff, Belt and Road is essentially an investment initiative, very much caught up in a broader foreign policy initiative in terms of pushing external to China, building sort of what are called the Belt and the Road, the Belt being the sort of Central Asian portion, the Road being the seafaring portion to the south. So what is really important here, and again, something that I develop at length in this book, are notions that what is happening in terms of repression in China itself have a real tendency to impact what's going on abroad. And the reason for this is that Xinjiang, as I said, is sort of the doorstep to this Belt and Road Initiative, right? This is the sort of exit point from China into Central Asia. And what we've seen is increasing sort of organizations taking notice of what is going on in terms of the repression of these populations, right? And we've seen attacks on Chinese investment, Chinese assets by organizations in places like Pakistan, directly referencing, hey, this is happening in part because of your treatment of Chinese Muslims, right? And so in some sense, no matter how tight they try to hold it in Xinjiang itself, there becomes this sort of increasing likelihood that repression then externalizes the conflict onto the Belt and Road, right? Where assets are considerably more vulnerable, where security is much, much harder to ensure because these are less tightly governed countries, right? And the capacity of the Chinese state is that much weaker there. So I think it's something we really need to keep an eye on, particularly as we see an attempt to, sorry, I got distracted by all these questions coming in, I appreciate that. Something we need to pay a lot of attention to, particularly as the US looks to pull out of Afghanistan, right? So again, this is a region that we think of as being sort of distant. We're like, oh, Afghanistan's one thing we're thinking about in the US, balancing China, that's another thing that we're thinking about. Those two are very tied up in one another. And as we vacate the Central Asian region, which is probably a pretty good idea, we have to anticipate situations where China is pulled into it, either because it wants to be, and there are some examples of that with China putting bases and assets, particularly around Afghanistan and Tajikistan and some places like that. But then also because they don't want to be. And what I mean by that is if there are attacks that impinge on Chinese interest emanating from abroad, they may find themselves in places like Afghanistan for very much the same set of reasons that we did. And that's something that I think we really haven't given a lot of thought to. So somebody asked, what is the role of religion in the Uyghur crisis? I'd argue that this is a really interesting question, and sort of a very contested one as people pull this through, talking about it from the Uyghur side, talking about it from the Chinese side. I'd argue that originally, at the genesis of this conflict, when we kind of go back to not the full genesis of it, but that 1989 kind of hinge that I was talking about, this was a much more nationalist, self-deterministic story than a religious story, right? However, a lot of the repression that followed, when you look at sort of how the Chinese targeted it, the Chinese state targeted it, very much targeted around religion, okay? And what's happening here as we move into these sort of further legitimation strategies that I was talking about, the type of nationalism that's occurring is increasingly sort of a Han ethno nationalism. And so where you used to have a model imported from the Soviet Union that was very much about, hey, there are these sort of different nations all striving towards a Marxist state in concert with one another, but perhaps a different pacing and all those sorts of ideas. It's never been a really good fit with the Chinese system. It's always been kind of uncomfortable, right? And so increasingly the policies verge toward religious eradication, right? It used to be that, we'll pick your imams, but you kind of do your own thing over in the corner as long as it doesn't get too sort of civil society-ish. Now it's really a question of any significant religious adherence is going to lead to potentially trouble for you and your family, right? And so it's becoming highly salient. Somebody else asked, do you believe, this was Jerry Warburg asked, do you believe that PRC, OBOR initiatives will empower those inside the US government to push more forcefully for more soft power tools, targeting of aid, vaccine exports? Is this a pivot point where the US might push for more ambitious international engagement? I think it is. I think that's a really well taken point. I think we're likely to see, and I think the vaccine thing is an important element of this. I think the Olympics thing is something that people are dipping their toes in for similar reasons. The trouble for the Chinese on this one is that the way that they're internally legitimizing what they're doing, convincing the Chinese people that, hey, we've got a place in the sun, is this sort of Han ethno-nationalist approach plus sort of a virulent kind of Chinese nationalism. But it very much puts an emphasis on strength and sort of being quite unyielding in their external postures, right? And you can sort of look some of this stuff up and talk about sort of wolf warrior diplomacy and these sorts of things. But there's just this real premium on a quite assertive posture, right? And it makes it really hard to sort of strategically give way in the manner that Chinese diplomats and sort of externally facing Chinese policy did for decades, where people would get a little bit upset about something and they kind of give ground until the West forgot about it and then it would smooth it over. This leads to a much more confrontational situation, and it makes soft diplomatic tools along the lines of those described in this question much more effective and much more attractive from the Western standpoint. I think the concern is that over time that sort of gels into what people have called a bamboo curtain or various other terms for this, but that the world becomes very kind of bifurcated by these policies, but certainly something to keep an eye on. And I anticipate that we are in fact going to see Chinese postures here pulling kind of the Western bloc together. And again, I say bloc because this is something, again, that European powers, US powers, Canada, other countries are all sort of able to coalesce around on the economic side. interests diverge somewhat. On the human rights side, they tend to come together. So another question, how much of Xi and the CCP's legitimacy as the ruling power in China, particularly Xi's ability to continue holding on to power, depends on the continuation of this approach toward Uyghurs, Xinjiang? I think quite a bit, right? And that I think the question is well taken, and a lot of what I want to convey is precisely that this is not sort of a lark, and a very dark lark, so that's not quite the right term for it, but this isn't something that's tangential or external to the main thrust of Chinese policy, right? Because it is so caught up in legitimacy and it is so caught up in what it means to be a strong China and to avoid, the continuation of 100 years of humiliation, key touch points in terms of where legitimacy comes from in this regime. Because of those things, it's very hard to back down. Right? It's very hard to back away from this. And so there is a sense that these positions are extremely strongly held for exactly that reason. And the personalization under Xi, this sort of more nationalistic stance, the way I'll often describe this to people is that it has rendered China a more normal autocracy. And what I mean by that is where China really stood apart as a country previously was in its ability to restrain itself, to hold back, right? So to accept a certain amount of, frankly, insulting behavior from foreign powers, to sort of have these steady conversations about peaceful rise, right? Oh, well, we're going to try to increase our economic strength. We're going to try to improve the lives of our people, but no, we do not want to confront you. We don't want to upset the international system. And that was possible because power wasn't caught up in an individual, and because the deliverable for the Chinese people was in fact economic growth. All right. Now that we're talking about a situation where it is not sort of a rule by relatively anonymous individuals in dark suits who are able to just sort of remove themselves from a situation, but this is about the power and prestige of Xi Jinping, combined with a more nationalistic approach that sort of says, hey, we're just not going to take it anymore, which is fundamentally what Chinese foreign policy is coming to look like. It is much, much harder to exhibit that type of restraint. And that is in fact much more normal, right? So what caused a lot of problems in US foreign policy was this ability to drag things out of the Chinese to sort of look at these very, very long time horizons. One of the things I think planners need to keep a close eye on nowadays is that these time horizons have shrunk considerably. All right, so another question that comes up here, is the global Muslim community doing anything to help the Uyghurs? If not, what's holding them back? Great question. So there have been some nascent moves in this direction. Frankly, what's holding them back is Chinese diplomacy. Right, so this has a lot of commonalities with the way China has approached Taiwan, right? Where, in the Taiwan case, China's just sort of steadily chipped away at all of the countries who wanted to recognize Taiwan, right, in the United Nations, and kind of peeled them back and moved them to Beijing, right? And they do this primarily through economic cooperation or inducements. So, making deals, making agreements, providing diplomatic cover, or whatever it might be. Very, very similar story going on with the broader Muslim community, in large part because when we're talking about sort of the leaders of the global Muslim community, this is often caught up in countries, right? And so, for example, we've seen the Saudis be very quiet on this issue compared to the position we might anticipate that they would take, right? And a lot of folks have written about and speculated on the extent to which this is tied to very concrete economic deals and inducements for the leadership of that country. One thing that, and I kind of referenced this before, that is sort of interesting is not the Muslim community is sort of one thing. What we have seen a little bit of is increasing recognition of this issue among highly militant factions, jihadist elements within organizations like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. And this really gets intertwined in interesting ways with some of the points I raised about the implications along the Belt and Road, the projection back into China of potential violence, and then Chinese foreign policy striking back out into Central Asia. Because if those sorts of organizations continue to kind of fixate on this issue, and you see it in their publications and whatnot, that can lead to a situation where it really does kind of escalate the overall violence level. So quite distinct from what I would describe as the global Muslim community, but another sort of audience that one should be paying attention to. So next question, how should the US and Europe approach China's growing influence in international organizations like the UN and WHO? So this, I think, is somewhat distinct from this overall question, but and complicates it, right? Because my take is that we need to make a lot of room for them in the UN and the WHO if we would like to kind of hold the global order as we've set it up together, right? You can't expect a country to be a status quo power if you don't provide them with relatively equal and even preferential access to the status quo. And so that then has to be balanced against some of the things I was saying before about, hey, we've got to stand up for our values here, right? We can't allow cultural genocide to occur in this country and just sort of turn a blind eye to it. And so I think there needs to be sort of a pretty bright line distinction between access to common goods as we've set them up in terms of international organizations, and the more specific country level responses or group of nation responses we might have to some of these human rights violations. All right. How has the new US administration changed our relations to China? Are we headed in a good direction? I don't think we've changed very much, right? And this is one of the things, this was very predictable. It's something that I think I and others in this area have been saying for quite a while, that we, on this one dimension, we really shouldn't anticipate much change between the Trump administration's policies and the Biden administration's policies. What I would hope for is that there becomes a little bit more consistency, right? You saw the sort of seesawing in the Trump administration between, tariffs, sometimes not terribly well directed tariffs, and then the attempt to cut a deal, and then feeling like the deal was close. And when the deal was close, then maybe overly exuberant language and about the potential for long-term cooperation with China. I think in the Biden administration, you're likely to see more sustained behavior on the more hostile side, frankly. The more, the extreme competition terminology that Biden used, I think is probably the correct one. This is not going to be a relationship that goes back to, how it was in the Clinton administration or something like that. Is that good? That's a tough one for me. I think we're in a very dangerous, highly competitive environment. I don't think that there is a version of policy that would put us in a better place, though, right? So I think that is sort of the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. And so I would describe it as probably the right policy at this time, but I think those who are implementing it are pretty cognizant that there is danger in this situation. Do you think there's any connection between China's actions versus the Uyghurs and India's aggressiveness toward the Kashmiri region? I think there is, right? It's at a deeper kind of theoretical level when you look at India's behavior in Kashmir, and frankly Pakistan's behavior as well. Very caught up in national pride, in a sense of what is right and what is sort of the proper place of the country. There is a historical contestation story in Kashmir that is very similar in some sort of deeper regards to the one that I described with regard to Xinjiang. They both go to this point of it is very challenging to disentangle these situations when they are caught up in what are perceived to be core national interests, right? One thing with regard to India that I think is relevant here that's important is when you look at some of these skirmishes that have been going on the China-India border, where China has been very much pushing on India in this regard, being quite aggressive. And again, I think a lot of analysts have been puzzled by, the why of this behavior. It's not valuable territory. This is, super high altitude. There's nothing up there. when it comes down to it. But what there is up there is an awful lot of national pride, right? So when you look at the way those confrontations have played in the Chinese media, for example, it becomes very clear how this is tied up in nationalism, in the inherent competition between China and India. And China takes a certain amount of nationalistic pride in, as they see it, sort of dominating that competition. And so, we're seeing this in multiple fronts. And that's sort of what I mean when I say situation in Xinjiang is linked to what is going on in Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, a variety of other places. So then we're running out of time. So last question here. Do you think the new Silk Road increases presence of China in debt and investment? Yes, right. The one thing that I think is pretty key here is a lot of countries, and this is sort of an interesting component of the Belt and Road, are becoming increasingly cognizant that there are strings attached when it comes to Chinese debt and investment, right? Where there was this sort of huge rush, we saw this in Africa sort of first, but now it's sort of starting to show up in Central Asia and other places as well. This rush to China as an alternative to the conditionalities that come from Western countries or the IMF or that, whatever it might be. There's this increasing recognition that actually China's largesse comes with its own set of conditionalities. They're not always as clearly written out, right? But in many ways, they can be considerably more pain-inducing when the time comes. And so the notion that China could in fact sort of take over your port or your road, whatever this is that they have invested in a significant way, is starting to dawn on countries. And so you're starting to see among the recipients of this type of aid or debt or investment or whatever it might be, a hedging strategy where they're approaching multiple countries in the West, China as well, Russia in some cases, in hopes of avoiding and kind of playing these sides off of one another in a strategic way. We saw a very similar dynamic unfold in the Cold War. And so there's very little that's surprising here. But I think what the US needs to consider is how to put enough volume into its investments and these sorts of things to be truly competitive in this domain. Because a lot of countries are in fact looking for an alternative. So I appreciate everyone's time. I hope this has been helpful. Please do feel free to email me with any questions you have, or if you'd like to get involved in the National Security Policy Center. My email address is very easy to remember, phil@virginia.edu. But with that, I will sign this off. Thanks. I appreciate everyone's time.